Staffing agents warned her. 48 hours. That stood as an absolute record for anyone surviving Falcone Manor. Maids didn't just quit. Past hires fled at midnight, leaving luggage behind instead of facing 3 brutal employers. 3 identical brothers, heirs ruling an unforgiving criminal syndicate, broke people for sport. But Maeve had $12 and one final eviction notice inside her coat pocket. She wasn't looking to survive a mafia empire. She just needed to make breakfast. Poverty is a persistent, low-grade fever. It settles in your joints, makes your head heavy, and narrows your vision until all you can see is the next bill. Maeve hadn't slept a full 8 hours since she was 16. Now, at 24, her bones felt hollowed out, scraped clean by double shifts, and the crushing weight of her sister's medical debt. The bus dropped her off 2 miles from the estate. She walked the rest of the way in the freezing November rain. Her boots leaked. The cardboard she'd shoved inside them to cover the holes in the soles soaked through within the first 10 minutes. By the time she reached the wrought iron gates of the Falcone property, she couldn't feel her toes. She didn't care. The hourly rate printed on the crumpled agency flyer in her pocket was triple the minimum wage. The estate was a sprawling monstrosity of grey stone and black glass, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning Atlantic. It looked less like a home, and more like a fortress holding its breath. A harried woman in a severe grey skirt suit met her at the service entrance. Mrs. Hess, the house manager. The woman was shoving folders into a leather briefcase with trembling hands. "You're the new girl," Mrs. Hess said, not looking up. She threw a ring of heavy brass keys onto the stainless steel counter of the mudroom. "You're a day late, not that it matters. The third-floor maids left yesterday. The downstairs valet walked out this morning." Maeve peeled off her soaked coat. "What exactly am I cleaning?" "Everything." Mrs. Hess finally looked at her. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin underneath them bruised with exhaustion. "But mostly you stay out of their way. If a door is shut, you do not open it. If you hear breaking glass, you wait 10 minutes before you enter with a broom. If they speak to you, you answer simply. You do not look them in the eye for too long." Mrs. Hess snapped the briefcase shut. She looked at her watch, a frantic edge to her movements. 48 hours, Maeve. If you last that long, I'll wire you the month's bonus myself. Just don't be a hero. They don't want a hero. They want ghosts. And with that, the manager was gone, the heavy service door clicking shut behind her. Maeve stood alone in the cavernous hallway. The silence in the house was heavy, oppressive. It felt thick enough to choke on. She picked up the keys, the metal biting into her cold, stiff fingers. She needed this job. She needed the warmth of the house. Her first task was the main living room. It was a sterile, sprawling space of white leather, chrome, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grey ocean. It looked like a museum exhibit where a murder was about to happen. She was dusting the mantelpiece when the front doors banged open. Heavy footsteps echoed on the marble, 3 sets. Maeve didn't stop dusting. She kept her eyes on the grain of the mahogany, moving the cloth in steady, rhythmic circles. "I told you to dump the car by the docks, not the quarry." The voice was cold, flat, carrying a terrifying authority. "The docks are crawling with feds, Roman. The quarry was cleaner." This second voice was rougher, edged with gravel and barely contained violence. "Both of you bore me," a third voice chimed in. It was smooth, musical, and completely devoid of warmth. "Can we just agree that the guy isn't breathing anymore and move on? I need a drink." Maeve chanced a glance in the mirror above the fireplace. The Falcone triplets. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and identical in face, but their energy fractured the room into 3 distinct threat levels. Roman wore a pristine 3-piece charcoal suit, his dark hair slicked back, his expression an unreadable mask of calculation. Declan's knuckles were split and bleeding, his leather jacket reeking of cigarette smoke and copper. Gabriel leaned against the doorway, a loose silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a lazy, dead-eyed smile playing on his lips. Declan caught her movement in the mirror. He stopped. The other 2 followed his gaze. The silence snapped back into the room, tighter this time. Maeve turned around. She held the dustcloth at her side. She didn't shrink. She didn't gasp at the blood dripping from Declan's hand onto the pristine white rug. She just looked at them, doing the math in her head. A ruined rug meant she'd have to use the industrial carpet cleaner, which meant she wouldn't clock out until at least 9. "Who the hell are you?" Declan asked. He stepped forward. He was a wall of muscle and aggression, designed to make people step back. Maeve held her ground. Her feet hurt too much to back up. "Maeve," she said. Her voice was flat. "The agency sent me." Roman analyzed her. His dark eyes flicked from her damp, frayed sweater down to her cheap, scuffed boots. He dismissed her instantly. "Mrs. Hess?" "She left 20 minutes ago," Maeve replied. Gabriel laughed. It was a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Another one bites the dust. What's the over-under on this one, Roman?" "Tomorrow by noon." "I'll take the stairs if you're done in here," Maeve said, turning back to her cart. The brothers paused. People didn't dismiss them. People didn't turn their backs. Declan stepped closer, looming over her cart. He pressed his bloody hand flat against the white wall, smearing a thick crimson handprint onto the plaster. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. He smelled like adrenaline and iron. "You missed a spot," he whispered. Maeve looked at the blood on the wall. She looked at his bleeding hand. She reached into her cart, pulled out a bottle of hydrogen peroxide and a clean rag, and set them on the table next to him. "Hold your hand over the sink when you use that," she said deadpan. "I just bleached the basins." She grabbed the handle of her cart and pushed it out of the room, leaving the 3 most dangerous men in the city staring silently at her back. The first 24 hours were an exercise in psychological warfare. The house was empty of all other staff. The chef had vanished after a dispute over a grocery order. The security team stayed strictly on the perimeter, leaving Maeve alone inside the glass fortress with 3 apex predators. They tested her. It wasn't coordinated, it was instinctive. They were men who had been treated like monsters for so long that they only knew how to interact with the world by breaking it. That night, Maeve was scrubbing the kitchen counters when a whiskey glass shattered against the tiled wall, missing her head by barely 2 inches. Amber liquid and crystal shards rained down onto the floor. She flinched. Just a micro-expression, a sudden tightening of her shoulders. But she didn't scream. She slowly turned her head. Declan was sitting at the massive kitchen island in the dark, a half-empty bottle in his hand. He was watching her, waiting for the tears, waiting for her to run to the door. Maeve looked at the glass. She looked at him. She walked over to the utility closet, retrieved the broom and dustpan, and walked back. She swept up the shards in silence. "You're supposed to run." Declan slurred slightly, the edge of violence softening into something that looked dangerously like confusion. "I'm supposed to clean," Maeve corrected, dumping the glass into the trash. "And you owe me an extra 10 minutes on my timesheet for this." The next afternoon, the threat shifted. Maeve was making a bed on the 2nd floor when she realized she wasn't alone. Gabriel was leaning against the doorframe, watching her. He had a habit of moving without making a sound, a phantom in expensive clothes. $12,000, Gabriel said smoothly. Maeve stopped pulling the duvet. She didn't look at him. "That's how much you owe the clinic for your sister's dialysis," Gabriel continued, walking slowly into the room. He picked up a silver picture frame from the nightstand, idly tracing the edge. "It's a shame. The system is rigged against people like you. No matter how many floors you scrub, you'll never catch up. The interest alone will drown you." He was trying to strip her bare, to find the nerve he could press to make her shatter. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to realize how powerful he was, how easily he could erase her debt, or her life. Maeve smoothed out a wrinkle in the pillowcase. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, panic threatening to rise in her throat at the violation of her privacy. But she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Since you're looking into my finances," Maeve said, keeping her voice incredibly steady, "you'll see my phone bill is due on Tuesday. So if you don't mind stepping off the rug, I need to vacuum." Gabriel's smile faltered. The cruelty in his eyes flickered, replaced briefly by genuine surprise. He stepped off the rug. Maeve turned on the vacuum, drowning him out entirely. Roman's test was the quietest, and therefore the most terrifying. On the evening of her 2nd day, she entered the library to empty the wastebaskets. Roman was seated behind a massive oak desk, lit only by a green banker's lamp. The desk was covered in ledgers, shipping manifests, and a disassembled Glock 19. He didn't acknowledge her. He was methodically oiling a spring. Maeve emptied the trash. As she turned to leave, Roman finally spoke. "The drawer on the left." Maeve stopped. "Excuse me?" "Open the drawer on the left." His voice was a low, commanding baritone. It wasn't a request. Maeve walked over to the desk. She pulled open the heavy oak drawer. Inside sat a thick stack of $100 bills banded in purple, easily $50,000. "Take a stack," Roman said, not looking up from his gun. "Go home, pay off the clinic, never come back." It was a trap. The money was a test of her greed, her loyalty, her desperation. If she took it, she proved she was just like everyone else, buyable, weak, a liability. If she didn't take it, she was a liar, pretending she didn't need it. Maeve stared at the money. It was salvation. It was a whole year of breathing easy. Her fingers twitched. The exhaustion in her bones screamed at her to grab it and run. Instead, she calmly closed the drawer. The heavy wood clicked shut. "I prefer direct deposit, Mr. Falcone. Cash is too hard to explain to the IRS. Roman stopped oiling the gun. He finally looked up at her, his dark eyes sharp and piercing. He studied her face, looking for the lie. He found nothing but the flat, dead-eyed exhaustion of a woman working a double shift. 46 hours, Roman murmured softly, checking his silver watch. "I'll be here tomorrow," Maeve said. She picked up her trash bag and walked out. Hour 48 came and went in the dark. Maeve woke up at 5 a.m. on her third day. She was staying in a tiny servants' quarter above the garage. The room was freezing, the radiator broken. She lay staring at the ceiling for 10 minutes, listening to the wind batter the glass, mentally calculating if she had enough money in her checking account for a bus pass next week. She was $30 short. She dragged herself out of bed, splashed freezing water on her face, and pulled on her uniform. When she entered the main house, it was eerily silent. The aftermath of a brutal night was evident. Mud and blood tracked across the foyer. A shattered vase in the hallway. A stray leather holster discarded on a velvet chair. She made her way to the kitchen to begin her morning chores. The house was completely devoid of staff. Even the emergency on-call chef hadn't arrived. The industrial kitchen, gleaming with stainless steel and copper pots that cost more than a used car, was dead and cold. Maeve's stomach gave a sharp, painful growl. She hadn't eaten since a stale granola bar yesterday afternoon. She opened the massive walk-in refrigerator. It was stocked with things she didn't know how to pronounce. Wagyu beef, truffles, artisanal cheeses, jars of caviar, useless rich people food that took hours to prepare. She dug deeper. In the very back, she found the basics. A carton of eggs, a brick of yellow butter, a heavy pack of thick-cut smoked bacon, a sack of flour, a bag of russet potatoes. It was 6 a.m. The brothers wouldn't be down until at least 8 if they slept at all. Maeve pulled out a massive cast-iron skillet. She didn't cook like a chef. She cooked like a woman trying to stretch a dollar, like someone who knew that heat, fat, and salt were the holy trinity of survival. She chopped the potatoes roughly, throwing them into the skillet with a heavy slab of butter. The kitchen filled with the sharp crackling sound of searing fat. She laid the thick cuts of bacon in another pan, letting the grease render down, the heavy smoky aroma fighting back the sterile cold smell of the house. When the potatoes were golden and crisp at the edges, she cracked 6 eggs directly into the bacon grease. She didn't bother with fancy plating. She threw together a rough, shaggy biscuit dough from the flour, buttermilk, and more butter, shoving the pan into the roaring oven. By 7 a.m., the kitchen smelled like a farmhouse. It smelled loud. It smelled like salt, smoke, burnt butter, and heavy, unapologetic warmth. Upstairs, the Falcone brothers were awake. None of them had slept. A hit had gone wrong at the docks the night before. They had spent the hours until dawn, covering their tracks, burying their mistakes, and nursing their paranoia. They were wired, hollowed out, and dangerous. Roman was the first to smell it. He stepped out of his bedroom, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, and paused. His brow furrowed. Gabriel stepped out of his room across the hall a moment later. He wasn't smiling. For once, the mask was entirely gone, leaving him looking exhausted and haunted. Declan came up the stairs from the basement gym, a towel slung over his bruised shoulders. None of them spoke. They just followed the scent, It wasn't the smell of a private chef crafting a delicate French omelette. It was a visceral, heavy smell. It bypassed the cold, calculating parts of their brains and struck directly at the primitive, buried core of their childhood. It smelled like Sunday mornings in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, before the cartel wars, before their father was gunned down, before their mother drank herself to death. It smelled like the only time in their lives they had ever been safe. They descended the stairs in unison. When they walked into the kitchen, the sight stopped them dead in their tracks. Maeve was standing at the stove, her back to them. Her hair was falling out of its messy bun. She was wearing an oversized apron over her cheap clothes. She was violently scraping the bottom of the cast-iron skillet with a wooden spoon, loosening the burnt, crispy bits of potato. She hadn't heard them come in. She pulled the biscuits from the oven. She dropped 3 massive, mismatched ceramic plates onto the kitchen island. She piled the plates high with steaming, grease-soaked potatoes, slapped down heavy strips of bacon, and slid 2 fried eggs on top of each mound. She dropped a hot, crumbling biscuit on the side of every plate. She turned around, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist, and finally saw them standing in the doorway. 3 ruthless crime lords, staring at plates of peasant food like they were looking at ghosts. Maeve froze. For a second, her cynical armor cracked. She had overstepped. Maids did not cook. Maids did not commandeer the kitchen. She braced herself for the explosion, for the shouting, for Declan to sweep the plates off the counter and shatter them. "I was hungry," Maeve said defensively, her voice slightly rough. "The chef isn't here. I made extra. Eat it or don't. I have to go mop the east wing." She untied her apron, threw it over a stool, and grabbed her cleaning cart. She expected a hand to grab her throat. She expected a gun. Instead, Roman stepped forward. He didn't look at her. He looked at the plate. He slowly pulled out a bar stool and sat down. Declan moved next, his movements stiff. He sat beside his brother. Gabriel was the last. He looked at Maeve, his eyes completely stripped of their usual mockery. There was something raw and unsettlingly vulnerable in his stare before he looked away and took his seat. Maeve stood frozen by her cart. Roman picked up a fork. He pierced the yolk of the egg. It bled rich and golden over the crispy potatoes. He took a bite. He closed his eyes. The tension that permanently locked his jaw seemed to fractionally loosen. Declan ate without a fork, tearing a piece of the hot bacon with his hands, chewing silently. Gabriel picked up the biscuit. He stared at it for a long moment before taking a bite. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the massive, cold house was the scrape of forks against ceramic. Maeve watched them. The monsters of the city, the men who broke people for sport, were sitting quietly at her counter, eating her cheap breakfast like starving children. She didn't smile. She didn't feel a sudden rush of affection. But the heavy, suffocating dread that had sat in her chest for the last 48 hours finally dissolved. They were just men. Broken, messy, dangerous men, but men nonetheless. And men who were eating didn't shoot you. "Leave the skillet," Declan mumbled, his mouth half full, not looking up from his plate. "I want the rest of the potatoes." "Wash your own plate when you're done," Maeve said flatly. She grabbed her cart and wheeled it out of the kitchen. For the first time since she arrived at the Falcone estate, she didn't look back. And for the first time in 10 years, the Falcone brothers ate a meal in complete, unburdened peace. Peace was a suspicious currency. Maeve didn't trust it. In her neighborhood, quiet meant the cops were circling or the dealers were re-upping. In the Falcone estate, quiet was supposed to mean she was alone, but she wasn't. The brothers hadn't left the house in 3 days. The psychological warfare abruptly stopped. The shift was jarring, like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. There were no more shattered glasses in the hallway. No more bloody handprints deliberately smeared on freshly painted walls. It started with the boots. On Thursday morning, Maeve walked into the mudroom carrying a bucket of soapy water, preparing to scrub the dried mud Declan always tracked in from the garage. Instead, she found his heavy, steel-toed boots sitting perfectly parallel on the rubber mat. The dried mud had been knocked off outside. She stared at them for a long time. It felt like a trap. Then came the coffee cups. Gabriel lived on black espresso, leaving a trail of porcelain cups balanced precariously on expensive ledges. By Friday, the cups started appearing in the kitchen sink. Rinsed, Roman was the worst of all. He simply started leaving the doors open. The heavy oak doors to his study, previously locked down like bank vaults, now stood ajar whenever she walked past. He didn't speak to her. He just sat at his desk, reading ledgers, letting her see him. It was a silent, unnerving declaration of transparency. Maeve kept her head down. She didn't thank them. She didn't acknowledge the change. She scrubbed the grout, bleached the toilets, and polished the silver until her knuckles cracked and bled from the harsh chemicals. She cooked breakfast at 6:30 every morning. Potatoes, eggs, bacon, toast. Heavy, cheap, hot. They ate it every day, sitting in a row at the kitchen island, mostly in silence. The first test of this new, bizarre ecosystem happened on Saturday. A crew of Roman's captains came to the house for a meeting. 5 men wearing cheap cologne and suits that fit too tight across the shoulders. They smelled like damp wool and violence. Maeve was in the hallway, polishing the brass fixtures of a side table, making herself invisible as they walked past. One of the men, a thick-necked enforcer named Corrado, stopped. He looked Maeve up and down, his eyes lingering on the curve of her waist beneath the cheap uniform. "Since when did we start hiring something decent to look at?" Corrado grunted. He reached out, his thick fingers grabbing a fistful of Maeve's apron. "Hey, sweetheart, bring a bottle of the good scotch to the den, and maybe take a little break while you're at it." Maeve froze. Her grip tightened on the polish rag. She calculated the distance to the door, the weight of the brass table lamp, the odds of surviving if she cracked his skull with it. She didn't have to do the math. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of the den. Declan. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, loose-limbed grace. He grabbed Corrado's wrist, the one holding Maeve's apron, and simply twisted. The sound of cartilage snapping echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous hallway. Corrado dropped to his knees, screaming, clutching his mangled wrist. The other 4 captains reached for their jackets, but froze when they saw the dead, flat expression on Declan's face. Declan stepped over the groaning man. He didn't look at the other captains. He looked at Maeve. He reached out and gently smoothed the wrinkled fabric of her apron where Corrado had grabbed it. His large, calloused fingers brushed against her hip. "The scotch is in the cabinet, Corrado," Declan said softly, his eyes never leaving Maeve's. "You get it yourself. She isn't here for you." He stepped back and walked back into the den. The remaining men hauled Corrado to his feet and dragged him away, casting terrified glances at Maeve as they passed. Maeve stood in the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at the brass fixture she was polishing. Her hands were shaking. She wasn't shaking because of Corrado. She was shaking because of the look in Declan's eyes. It wasn't protection, it was ownership. She grabbed her rag and scrubbed the brass until her reflection in the metal warped. She had survived 48 hours, but she was starting to realize she might never actually leave. Poverty doesn't let you breathe. Just when you think your head is above water, something grabs your ankle and pulls you straight down to the bottom. For Maeve, that anchor was a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the basement laundry room, pulling hot sheets from the industrial dryer. The basement was her sanctuary. It was warm, smelled like clean linen, and the hum of the machines drowned out the heavy silence of the house above. Her cheap prepaid phone vibrated in her pocket. "Maeve!" It was Chloe. Her younger sister's voice was thin, raspy, exhausted by the dialysis machines that kept her alive. "Hey, Bug," Maeve said, pinning the phone between her ear and shoulder as she folded a pillowcase. "How's the clinic? You warm enough?" "Maeve, they unhooked me." The pillowcase slipped from Maeve's fingers. It hit the concrete floor. "What do you mean they unhooked you? Your session isn't over for another 2 hours." "The billing department came down," Chloe choked out, a sob breaking in her throat. "They said the account is too far in arrears. They said they can't legally deny emergency care. But standard dialysis doesn't count until my kidneys completely fail. They told me to pack my things." The world tilted. The concrete floor felt like it was dropping away. Maeve couldn't breathe. A cold, absolute terror seized her spine. The $12,000. The debt Gabriel had taunted her with. It hadn't just accrued interest. It had hit the critical threshold. "Put the nurse on the phone," Maeve ordered. Her voice sounded foreign, hollow and sharp. Chloe, hand the phone to the administrator. He won't talk to you, Maeve. He said to call the billing office during normal hours. Chloe was openly crying now. I'm scared. My chest hurts. I'm coming. Sit in the lobby. Do not leave the building. I am coming right now. Maeve hung up. She didn't finish folding the sheets. She left the dryer door open. She ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, tearing her apron off over her head. She burst into the main foyer. She needed a car. She needed a ride to the city. The buses didn't run out here for another 3 hours. 3 hours was too late. Roman was descending the grand staircase, buttoning a charcoal suit jacket. He stopped mid-step, taking in her wide, panicked eyes, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the apron discarded on the marble floor. "Where are you going?" Roman asked. The cold indifference was gone from his voice. It was sharp, alert. "I need to leave. Now!" Maeve didn't have time for deference. She walked straight toward the front door. Roman moved faster than a man in a tailored suit had any right to. He stepped in front of the massive double doors, blocking her exit. "You don't run in this house, Maeve," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "Not unless someone is chasing you. Tell me who is chasing you." "Nobody is chasing me," Maeve screamed, her cynical shell shattered, the desperation clawing its way out of her throat. "The clinic kicked my sister out. They stopped her dialysis. She's going to die if I don't get her to a county hospital right now, and I don't have a car, and the bus isn't coming. Move." She shoved her hands against his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall. Roman didn't budge. He looked down at her hands, then up to her face. "What is the name of the clinic?" "St. Jude's," she sobbed, the fight leaving her abruptly as the reality of her helplessness set in. "But it doesn't matter. I owe them 12 grand. They won't take her back without payment." Roman stared at her for 2 seconds. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Declan, bring the SUV to the front now." He hung up and dialed another number. "Lorenzo, find the board members of St. Jude's Medical Center. All of them. Get the chief administrator on the phone. Do not ask his assistant. Put a gun to his head if you have to. Connect him to me." Maeve stared at him, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "What are you doing?" "I am handling it," Roman said simply. "I can't pay you back for this," Maeve said, her voice shaking. "I didn't take the money from your desk. I won't owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Roman said, stepping away from the door as Declan pulled a black, armored SUV onto the gravel drive, tires kicking up dust. Gabriel was already in the passenger seat. "Get in the car, Maeve," Roman ordered. They drove like demons. Declan navigated the winding coastal roads with brutal efficiency, pushing the heavy SUV well past 100 miles an hour. In the back seat, Roman's phone rang. He put it on speaker. "Mr. Falcone!" A trembling, reedy voice filled the car. "This is Dr. Harrison, the chief administrator at St. Jude's. I was told it was an emergency." "Dr. Harrison," Roman said pleasantly. It was the most terrifying sound Maeve had ever heard. "I understand you have a patient named Chloe. You removed her from her dialysis machine 20 minutes ago." We have strict billing policies, Mr. Falcone. The account is severely delinquent." "Are you familiar with a company called Apex Logistics, Doctor?" Roman interrupted. A heavy, terrified silence fell over the line. Apex Logistics was the front company for the Falcone syndicate. It controlled the shipping ports. It controlled the medical supply lines entering the city. "Yes," the doctor whispered. "Good. Then you know I own the trucks that deliver your sterile saline, your surgical masks, and the replacement parts for your machines. If Chloe is not back in a chair, hooked up to a machine in the next 5 minutes, St. Jude's will never receive another shipment of medical supplies. Your doctors will be operating with dirty hands in the dark by Friday." Maeve gasped, pressing her hand over her mouth. "Mr. Falcone, please, you can't—" "5 minutes, Doctor, and regarding her bill, wipe it. If I ever hear that a bill has been sent to that family again, I won't send my lawyers. I will send my brother. Am I understood?" "Yes," the doctor sobbed. "Yes, I understand. I'm paging her nurses right now. She's going back in." Roman hung up. He tossed the phone onto the leather seat. He looked at Maeve. She was trembling, staring at him as if she were looking at a monster. "She's safe," Roman said quietly. "You threatened to destroy a hospital," Maeve whispered. Gabriel leaned back from the front seat, his dark eyes locking onto hers in the rearview mirror. "We didn't threaten a hospital, Maeve. We threatened a man in a suit who tried to kill your sister over paper money. Don't confuse the two. They didn't speak the rest of the way. When they arrived at the clinic, Chloe was safely back in her chair, a nervous ring of nurses hovering around her, offering her warm blankets and juice. Maeve held her sister's hand. The heavy weight of the world suddenly lifted from her shoulders. But as she looked through the glass doors of the clinic and saw the black SUV idling in the rain, she realized the truth. The debt hadn't been erased. It had just been transferred to a creditor who didn't deal in cash. 3 weeks later, the house was unrecognizable. Not visually. The marble still gleamed. The glass was still spotless. The minimalist furniture sat in its rigid geometry. The change was atmospheric. The house was no longer a tomb. The staff had slowly trickled back, vetted and approved by Roman. A chef returned. A groundskeeper. 3 new maids to handle the upper floors. But Maeve wasn't one of them anymore. She technically still wore the uniform. She still pushed a cart. But an invisible, absolute boundary line had been drawn around her. The other staff treated her with a wide-eyed, terrified reverence. The chef cooked her separate, high-end meals. The other maids wouldn't dare touch the main living room or the brothers' bedrooms. They left those for her, retreating to the edges of the house whenever she entered a room. She was no longer the broke maid. She was the untouchable center of the syndicate's orbit. It suffocated her. On a cold Thursday evening, the breaking point arrived. Maeve was in the kitchen, scrubbing the cast-iron skillet. The new chef, a nervous Parisian man, had tried to make her breakfast routine, but the brothers had pushed the plates away. Maeve had quietly taken over, rendering the bacon fat herself, keeping her head down. Gabriel walked in. He was wearing a dark cashmere sweater, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He didn't hover in the doorway anymore. He walked straight into her space, leaning against the counter, close enough that she could smell the oak and smoke of his liquor. "Mrs. Hess quit today," Gabriel said casually, taking a sip. Maeve paused her scrubbing. "She just got back last week. She said the dynamic of the house made her uncomfortable." Gabriel tilted his head, watching the soap bubbles coat her raw hands. Roman told her to leave her keys. "You need a house manager," Maeve said, rinsing the pan. "We have one." Maeve turned off the water. The silence in the kitchen stretched, pulled taut like a piano wire. "I am a maid, Gabriel," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a low, firm register. "I clean toilets. I do the laundry. I'm not a manager." "You haven't cleaned a toilet in 2 weeks," a new voice said. Declan stepped out of the pantry. He had a bruise flowering along his jawline, a fresh cut above his eyebrow. He ignored it, walking toward her, crowding her from the other side. Roman entered the kitchen behind him, pulling the heavy oak doors shut. The click of the latch sounded incredibly loud. Maeve backed up against the sink. Her heart rate spiked. She wasn't afraid of them hurting her. That fear had died weeks ago. She was afraid of the suffocating weight of their attention. It was too heavy. It demanded a surrender she wasn't willing to give. "What is this?" Maeve demanded, looking at all 3 of them. "You're off the cleaning rotation," Roman said, stepping into the center of the kitchen. "The agency has been bought out. You technically don't work for them anymore. You work directly for the estate. Your salary has been adjusted. I don't want an adjusted salary. I want my job. I want my boundaries." Maeve gripped the edge of the counter. She looked directly at Roman, refusing to break eye contact. "I am not a pet. I am not a charity case because you paid off a hospital. I work for my money. I survive on my own." Declan stepped closer. He reached out, his bloody, bruised hand hovering over hers on the counter before gently wrapping his fingers around her wrist. It wasn't a restraint. It was an anchor. "Nobody thinks you're a pet, Maeve," Declan rumbled, his voice rough. "You walked into a house full of monsters, looked us in the eye, and told us to wipe our boots. You survived us. We don't know how to do normal, Maeve," Gabriel added softly, setting his glass down. The mocking edge in his voice was completely gone. "We don't do boundaries well. Everything we touch, we ruin. Except you. You don't break." Roman stepped forward, closing the final gap. He stood directly in front of her. The sheer, overwhelming presence of all 3 of them was intoxicating and terrifying. "You want to work?" Roman asked quietly. "Fine. You manage the staff. You manage the accounts for the estate. You cook breakfast when you feel like it. But you do not wear that cheap uniform anymore. And you do not leave. You can't keep me here, Maeve challenged, her chin tilted up defensively. We aren't keeping you, Roman replied. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a heavy set of keys, the master keys to the estate, the gates, the cars. He placed them on the counter next to her hand. The gates are open. Your sister's medical care is funded in perpetuity through a blind trust. The debt is 0. Roman looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping her bare. You are entirely free to walk out that door right now, Maeve. No one will stop you. No one will follow you. Maeve looked at the keys. She looked at the open kitchen door leading to the hallway and the front doors beyond it. She could leave. She had exactly what she came for. She had survived. She looked up at Gabriel, whose eyes were unusually guarded, bracing for rejection. She looked at Declan, whose thumb was slowly, rhythmically stroking the inside of her wrist. She looked at Roman, the cold architect of the empire, waiting patiently for her verdict. They were violent, broken, and dangerous. They lived in a world of blood and shadows, but they had eaten her burnt potatoes. They had threatened an empire to save a girl they didn't even know. They didn't just want her. They needed her. She was the only warm thing in their freezing world. Maeve let out a long, shaky breath. The cynicism that had protected her for 24 years slowly began to fracture. She reached out. She didn't pick up the keys. Instead, she picked up the dish towel. Breakfast is at 7 tomorrow, Maeve said, tossing the towel onto the counter. She looked at Declan's bruised face. And sit on the stool. I need to clean that cut before you bleed on my clean floors. Roman let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. Gabriel smiled. A real, slow, genuine smile. Declan just pulled out the bar stool and sat down, obediently tipping his head back for her. Maeve grabbed the first aid kit. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She had taken over the house. Becoming the manager of the Falcone estate didn't magically erase 24 years of survival instinct. Maeve still woke up at 5 in the morning. Her body simply refused to unlearn the panic of an unpaid light bill, even when her new bank account held a 6-figure salary, heavily taxed and perfectly legal through Apex Logistics. She ditched the cheap frayed uniform. She wore thick knit sweaters, dark denim, and sturdy boots. She moved through the massive house, not as a ghost, but as its pulse. The staff realized quickly that Maeve was the only functioning translator for the brothers' violence. If Roman was locked in his study with the heavy oak doors shut for more than 6 hours, the maids knew to stay off the second floor. If Declan came back from the docks smelling like diesel and copper, the valets knew not to ask for the keys to the SUV. But Maeve didn't avoid them. She walked directly into the blast zones. A month after the incident with Corrado, the tension in the house began to shift from internal to external. A localized cold front settled over the brothers. It was a Tuesday. Maeve was in the kitchen, standing over the commercial stove, slowly stirring a pot of steel-cut oats. The new chef, a quiet man named Thomas, had learned to simply prep her ingredients and step aside before 7 o'clock. Roman sat at the island, his laptop open, the blue light catching the sharp angles of his face. He hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his pristine suit jacket draped over the back of the stool. Gabriel sat next to him, spinning a silver lighter on the marble counter. Clack, spin, clack. The rhythmic sound was usually annoying, but today it sounded like a countdown. Declan wasn't there. That was the first red flag. Where is he? Maeve asked, not looking away from the stove. She tapped the wooden spoon against the rim of the pot. Roman didn't look up from his screen. Tying up a loose end in the harbour. Corrado's people, she asked flatly. Gabriel stopped spinning the lighter. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto her. You listen at doors, Maeve. I don't have to, she replied, bringing 3 heavy ceramic bowls to the counter. You talk in the hallways, and Corrado's cousins haven't picked up their shipments from the South Terminal in 3 weeks. The cargo manifests in the front office show a backlog of perishable goods. You don't let goods rot unless the route is compromised. Roman finally closed his laptop. He looked at her, a slow, dark spark of genuine respect cutting through his exhaustion. You've been reading the freight logs. I manage the estate's expenses, Maeve said, setting a bowl of steaming oats in front of him. I like to know where the money comes from. Eat. Roman picked up his spoon. Corrado had a brother, Marco. He's making noise. He thinks because Declan snapped a captain's wrist over a staff member, the family is going soft. He's rallying a few of the old blood crews in the North End. Is he a threat? Maeve asked. She didn't panic. She just needed the data. Poverty had taught her that panicking wasted energy. No, Gabriel said smoothly, taking a bite of the hot oats. He's a nuisance. Declan is reminding him of the difference this morning. The heavy mahogany front doors slammed open, the sound echoing all the way down the hall to the kitchen. Heavy, uneven footsteps slapped against the marble. Maeve froze. The brothers moved with a sudden, synchronized lethality. Roman's hand vanished inside his jacket. Gabriel didn't reach for a gun. He simply picked up the heavy steel carving knife left on the cutting board, his posture instantly shifting from relaxed to predatory. Declan staggered into the kitchen doorway. He was soaked in freezing rain. His leather jacket was torn at the shoulder, and a thick, dark line of blood was running down his neck, soaking into the collar of his grey shirt. He was breathing heavily, his knuckles shredded. "Marco?" Roman asked, his voice dead of all emotion. "Dealt with," Declan rasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He looked at Roman. But he wasn't making noise to rally crews. He was making noise to draw me out. It was a distraction. A distraction from what? Gabriel asked, the knife perfectly still in his hand. Declan lifted his head. His eyes bypassed his brother's entirely and locked onto Maeve. The raw animal panic in his gaze made her blood run cold. "They aren't at the docks," Declan breathed. "They're coming here." The words hadn't even fully settled in the air when the first explosion shook the foundation of the house. The concussive wave hit the kitchen windows, shattering the reinforced glass inward. A shower of deadly, glittering shards rained across the marble floor. Gabriel lunged, grabbing Maeve by the waist of her thick sweater and hauling her down behind the massive, steel-reinforced kitchen island, just as a barrage of automatic gunfire tore through the plaster where she had been standing. Dust and powdered drywall choked the air. The deafening roar of the security gates being breached echoed from the driveway. "Front gate is gone," Roman yelled over the din, drawing a matte black Glock. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. The cold, calculating facade had burned away, leaving a ruthless, hardened killer. Declan, secure the east hallway. Gabriel, the basement access. "I'm not leaving her," Gabriel snarled, pressing his back against the cabinets, his eyes darting toward the shattered window. "I don't need you to babysit me," Maeve coughed, waving the plaster dust from her face. Her hands were shaking, a hard, violent tremor, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. The perimeter alarms didn't trip. They cut the hard lines. Declan slid across the floor, pressing in close beside her. He smelled like rain, copper, and gun smoke. The cut on his neck was bleeding freely, staining his shirt a brilliant crimson. "There are at least 20 of them," Declan grunted, ejecting a spent magazine from his pistol and slamming a fresh one home. Marco hired outside contractors. Mercenaries, not our usual street trash. Another volley of gunfire chewed up the expensive espresso machine on the counter above them, sending boiling water and steam hissing into the air. "We need to move to the panic room in the sub-basement," Roman ordered, checking the angle of the doorway. "Maeve, you stay between Gabriel and me. Declan, take point." "No," Maeve said sharply. 3 identical sets of lethal dark eyes snapped to her. "The sub-basement panic room operates on a closed-circuit biometric lock," Maeve said, her voice strained but steady. She looked at Roman. "The backup generator for the East Wing failed its diagnostic test on Tuesday. I called the technicians, but they aren't coming until tomorrow. If they cut the main power, which they will, the biometric lock is dead. We'll be trapped in the hallway outside the vault." Roman stared at her, processing the information in a fraction of a second. "You're sure?" "I signed the maintenance checks, Roman. Yes, I'm sure." The lights above them flickered, hissed, and died. The massive house plunged into a heavy grey gloom, illuminated only by the stormy morning light filtering through the shattered windows. "She's right," Gabriel murmured, a deadly smile touching his lips. "They just cut the main line." "Where do we go?" Declan asked. He didn't ask Roman. He asked Maeve. "The old Prohibition tunnels," Maeve said immediately, "behind the industrial laundry machines. The door is mechanical, heavy iron. It leads out to the cliffs. From there, we can circle back to the tree line, where the security team keeps the perimeter ATVs. Move, Roman commanded. They moved as a single violent unit. Declan went first, his massive frame shielding the hallway as he laid down 2 precise, deafening shots, dropping a mercenary who had just rounded the corner. Maeve scrambled behind him, her boots slipping briefly on the bloody marble before Gabriel's hand clamped onto her shoulder, steadying her. Roman brought up the rear, his face a mask of absolute icy focus, covering their blind spots. They tore down the servants' stairs. The air here was darker, smelling of damp concrete and bleach. Footsteps echoed above them, shouting. The house was being torn apart. They reached the laundry room. Maeve pushed past Declan, rushing toward the massive industrial dryers. She shoved her hands into the narrow, dusty gap between the machine and the wall, feeling for the heavy iron latch Mrs. Hess had casually mentioned during a walkthrough weeks ago. Her fingers closed around the freezing metal. She pulled. It didn't budge. Rust and decades of disuse held it fast. Move, Declan grunted. He stepped in, his bloody hands gripping the lever over hers. He braced his boots against the concrete wall and hauled backward with a violent, animalistic roar. The rust shrieked. The heavy iron door cracked open, revealing a pitch-black, narrow tunnel smelling of salt and decay. Go, Gabriel pushed her forward. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the stairs burst open. 3 men in tactical gear spilled onto the landing, their rifles sweeping the dark room. Roman, down! Declan roared. The basement erupted into a blinding strobe light of muzzle flashes. The noise in the enclosed concrete space was physically painful, a crushing pressure against the eardrums. Maeve fell backward into the dark tunnel. She watched, horrified, as Gabriel moved with a liquid, terrifying grace. He didn't seek cover. He stepped directly into the line of fire, his pistol snapping up. He fired 3 times in less than a second. 3 bodies hit the stairs, but a 4th man had dropped to a knee on the landing. His rifle tracked Gabriel. Gabriel! Maeve screamed. Roman stepped in front of his brother. He didn't flinch as the rifle fired. The impact spun Roman violently, throwing him against the concrete wall. Declan returned fire, a sustained, thunderous barrage that tore the 4th man apart. Silence slammed back into the room, heavy and ringing. Maeve scrambled out of the tunnel, her knees scraping against the rough floor. Roman! Roman was sliding down the wall, clutching his left shoulder. Blood was pulsing rapidly through his fingers, soaking his crisp white shirt in a massive, spreading stain. His skin was already turning a waxy, greyish pale. Gabriel caught him under the arms, his usual composure entirely shattered. Roman, hey, look at me. It's through and through, Roman ground out, his teeth clenched in agony. He looked at the blood on his hands. Missed the artery, I think. Get him inside, Maeve ordered. The panic was gone. The raw survival instinct that kept her sister alive through years of medical emergencies took the wheel. Now! Declan and Gabriel hauled their older brother into the dark tunnel. Maeve grabbed the heavy iron door and pulled it shut, throwing the rusted deadbolt just as heavy boots hit the basement stairs outside. They were plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The air in the tunnel was freezing, carrying the sharp, briny bite of the Atlantic Ocean. Gabriel pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket, clicking it on. The narrow beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the damp stone walls and the ragged breathing of the men around her. Roman was sitting against the curved wall of the tunnel, his head tipped back, his eyes closed. Gabriel was pressing a torn strip of his own shirt against the bullet wound, his hands shaking slightly. Declan stood guard at the iron door, his gun raised, listening to the muffled shouts and banging from the laundry room. The iron will hold, he muttered. But we can't stay here. The cold will put him in shock. Maeve dropped to her knees beside Roman. She didn't ask for permission. She pushed Gabriel's hands out of the way. Let me, she said. Her voice left no room for argument. She unbuttoned Roman's soaked shirt, peeling the fabric back to expose the wound. It was ugly, a jagged, tearing hole just below his collarbone. But the blood flow was steady, not the bright, pulsing spurts of a severed artery. She stripped off her thick knit sweater, leaving her in just a thin, long-sleeve thermal. She pulled the heavy wool up and pressed it directly into the wound, leaning her entire body weight against Roman's shoulder to apply maximum pressure. Roman groaned, his eyes flying open. His gaze locked onto hers. The cold, untouchable boss of the Falcone syndicate looked entirely stripped down. "I'm ruining your sweater," Roman rasped, a ghost of a smirk pulling at the corner of his pale mouth. "I manage the accounts," Maeve shot back, not easing the pressure. "I'll expense it. Keep breathing, Roman." She looked up at Gabriel. "Hold this exactly like this. Don't let up." Gabriel took over, his large hands replacing hers. Maeve stood up. She looked down the long, black expanse of the tunnel. "We have to walk. There's a medical cache in the security ATVs by the tree line. We get him there, we patch him, and we use the radios to call Lorenzo's cleanup crew." Declan looked at her. Really looked at her. She was shivering in the freezing damp, her hands and face smeared with Roman's blood, plaster dust in her hair. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hysterical. She was doing the math, calculating the odds of survival, just like she had on her very first day. "You should have left," Declan said quietly, his voice rough with something that sounded dangerously like awe. "When Roman gave you the keys, you should have walked out." Maeve looked at the three of them. Monsters. Killers. The men who owned the city. They were battered, bleeding, and hiding in a wet tunnel, looking at her like she was the only light left in the world. "You guys would starve without me," she said flatly. "Help him up." The walk took 20 minutes. It felt like 10 hours. By the time they reached the iron grate that opened up to the cliffside, the storm had broken, leaving a cold, pale grey sky. The security ATVs were exactly where they were supposed to be, hidden beneath heavy camouflage netting in the pines. Maeve found the trauma kit. She worked with a brutal, practiced efficiency, packing Roman's wound with hemostatic gauze and wrapping it tight. Lorenzo's crew arrived an hour later in 3 unmarked black vans. By the time they were driven to a secure, private safe house in the city, the adrenaline had crashed. The reality of the morning settled heavily into Maeve's bones. The safe house was a high-rise penthouse. Sterile, quiet, safe. Roman was sedated in the master bedroom, a private surgeon having stitched the wound. Declan was asleep on a leather sofa, completely exhausted. Maeve stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling wet city below. Her hands were finally clean, but she could still feel the phantom stickiness of the blood. She heard soft footsteps behind her. Gabriel. He didn't speak. He stepped up beside her, looking out at the same skyline. He handed her a steaming mug of black coffee. She took it, letting the heat sink into her freezing palms. "They're gone," Gabriel said quietly. "Marco. The mercenaries. Lorenzo's people cleared the estate. It's over." Maeve took a sip. It was bitter and strong. "Who's going to clean the blood out of the marble?" she asked, her tone entirely serious. "It stains if you let it set." Gabriel laughed. It was a soft, genuine sound, completely devoid of his usual sharp edges. He turned his head, looking down at her. His dark eyes were warm, open, and incredibly heavy with an unspoken promise. "We'll hire a crew," Gabriel said. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing against her cheek, wiping away a smudge of soot she had missed. "You're never scrubbing another floor, Maeve." She looked up at him. She thought about her old apartment, the freezing radiator, the crushing, suffocating weight of being utterly alone in a world designed to break you. She wasn't alone anymore. She had walked into a fortress of apex predators, armed with nothing but a cast-iron skillet and an absolute refusal to be a victim. And she had accidentally built a family. A violent, deeply fractured, fiercely protective family. "Good," Maeve breathed, leaning ever so slightly into his touch. "Because I'm cooking potatoes tomorrow. And the skillet is heavy," Gabriel smiled. "We'll carry it for you." Surviving 48 hours with Mafia bosses was supposed to be impossible, until Maeve changed all the rules with a cast-iron skillet. But the real danger wasn't the blood or the bullets. It was realizing she never wanted to leave. If you love this intense, gritty story of survival and unconventional romance, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves strong, no-nonsense heroines, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark, deeply human Mafia storytelling. Drop a comment below. What would you have cooked to survive the brothers? See you in the next video.